So in this fifth screencast, we are going to look at the consequences of global warming, and in fact, all global changes that will be taking place. So we've already looked at some data that has shown that the temperature of the Earth is increasing, and we've looked at data that says the temperature of the Earth is increasing due to the number of greenhouse gases or the amount of greenhouse gases that human activity is adding to the atmosphere. But at first blush, it might look like, so what? What's wrong with a few degrees warmer temperature? What's wrong with some of these other global changes that we've talked about? So in this screencast, we're going to look specifically at the environmental consequences, which includes physical effects and effects on organisms. And we'll also look at human impact, which includes economic impact and social impact. So let's first take a look at the consequences to the environment. The first one on the list here is melting of the polar ice caps, Greenland and Antarctica. So the polar ice caps are shrinking in sheer magnitude at the size of the spread. They are melting earlier in the season, and they are also thinner. And we will look at some of the consequences, but one that you've already seen is the effect on the ecosystem in terms of the polar bears, the seals, the Arctic foxes. So the melting of polar ice caps, Greenland and Antarctica, will have some significant consequences to the environment. There's also melting of glaciers around the world. So this picture here is a picture of a glacier called Muir Glacier in Alaska. And this was it about 50 years ago, and then this is it 50 years later. And you can see that vast majority of this glacier is now water. And we'll look at some of the consequences of those melting glaciers on subsequent slides. A third one is melting of the permafrost. So you may remember from the chapter on different ecosystems that permafrost is a layer of soil that was thought to be permanently frozen. And that has a significant role in the environment. And one is that it prevents the very modest amount of rainfall and snowmelt that occurs in places like Alaska to not continue to seep into the soil, but to be held closer to the surface where plants with their short growing season can have access to significant water. Another issue with melting of permafrost that we'll look at on subsequent slides is that we have anchored a lot of our structures, including oil pipelines, are anchored into the permafrost. And last but not least on this list of consequences to the environment are rising sea levels. When glaciers and ice sheets melt, the water is fresh water, so that changes the salinity, and because as it warms even higher, it expands, and that results in higher sea levels. So let's look at a little more detail about each of these. The first one was the melting of polar ice caps, Greenland and Antarctica. So that could actually have some positive effects economically, in that it would increase shorter shipping routes and allow the shipping routes to have a longer season. And that is important to many countries, including the U.S., in terms of transportation for oil and natural gas, but really even shipping routes for anything. Instead of crossing the ocean by going, say, in a westerly direction, it's sometimes shorter to go over the poles to reach another destination with your goods. A second issue with the melting of the polar ice caps is that it will change salinity and temperature. And by changing salinity and temperature, it will change the global circulation patterns of the oceans. Remember, the ocean water, it's all one ocean, it's not seven seas, and water moves around in a certain pattern, and part of the drive for that pattern is changes in temperature and salinity. And last, by having these melting polar ice caps, it changes habitats and affects biodiversity. Again, that would be the example of the polar bear. Now, if we look at the melting of glaciers around the world, it will have effects on the water cycle because some of those melting glaciers in higher altitudes would cyclically, when we have different seasons, some of that would melt and would feed rivers and so forth. And also even become part of the atmospheric water cycle. And so changes to the glaciers may change the water cycle as well, and that would affect habitats. There's a disturbing example here with Glacier National Park, which is in Montana. In 1850, there were 150 glaciers there. And by 2012, they were down to 25. I have not looked up how many there are right now. I'm sure it's even fewer, so I'll get back to you on that. But it is predicted by 2030, all of the glaciers will be gone from Glacier National Park. So if you want to see a glacier there, you probably should plan a trip soon. Okay, so next is melting of permafrost. I mentioned already the draining of surface water, which plants rely on. Pipelines are anchored there, and when the pipeline is not supported properly, these are very, very long pipelines, and so some of the pipelines can be damaged and even leak. Another effect of melting permafrost is that under the permafrost is often a layer of soil that contained organic matter that decomposed anaerobically with anaerobic bacteria, and therefore the material has turned to methane. And when the permafrost melts, that methane is released into the atmosphere. And in fact, you can even find video, much like the ones that we talked about when we talked about natural gas getting into someone's water supply and they could light their faucet water on fire. There are videos of people in places like Alaska lighting on fire these ports through which the methane is being released. Okay, and last, the rising sea levels. So while it may not sound that important if the sea level has risen, say, 9 inches, but if it continues to rise, we need to understand that there are 100 million people that live within 3 feet of sea level. So that is a lot of people who will be affected. Another issue with rising sea levels is saltwater intrusion. So if you have our aquifer in coastal areas like we have here on Cape Cod, and there is no actual barrier between the fresh water and the salt water, there's just a slight density difference. But as the salt water rises, there's more pressure put on that freshwater aquifer, so much so that once too much pressure from the rising sea level, it causes the salt water to intrude and ruins the aquifer. A third issue with rising sea levels is it's not just the level of the sea at any given moment. If there's a storm which produces a storm surge, and the storm surge was, let's say, normally 3 feet, but then is now almost 4 feet, that will affect millions of people in a much more serious manner. Okay, so those are 4 predominant consequences to the environment. We're going to take a look at some more. Let's look first at heat waves. That's a balance between having more heat waves, which would kill people, and having fewer cold spells, which can also kill people. So we may find some kind of balancing between the two. But in actuality, there have been thousands of people killed by heat waves in the last several decades, and so that is something serious to consider. And a second one is that not only are there changes in temperature, there are also changes in precipitation patterns. So an area that used to get sufficient water is no longer, it's becoming dry. A third change is increase in storm intensity. Hurricanes form over warm water. The warmer the water, the increase in hurricane intensity. And it's been documented that in Hurricane Katrina, the Gulf water was warmer than it had been in the past, which led to Katrina building up to a Category 5, which, as I'm sure you know, had serious consequences. Another one that I've already alluded to is the global shifts in ocean currents. This is not only important in distributing the ocean water, but the ocean currents bring a moderation in temperature to the coastal regions that they go past. So when you shift the ocean currents, you may make a region warmer or colder than it has been known to be in recent centuries. And last, you can have drought that leads to increased wildfires, because if there's drought and the trees are too dried out, then they are going to spread more rapidly and have a more intense forest fire. That has consequences also for humans when we have cities and so forth nearby, and we have firefighters risking their lives to put out a forest fire. So I have just a few remaining slides on consequences to the environment and humans, so let's see if we can get those in. This slide here shows a change in global sea level, and basically it has risen about 9 inches in the past 20 years, or actually a little longer than 20 years, in the past century. This here is an example of what can happen. This is a country called the Maldives, which is at low sea level and is already feeling the impacts of sea level rise. In particular, it is threatening its aquifer, and the country is predicted to no longer be in existence by in very recent decades. Okay, next we're going to look at consequences of a global climate change to living organisms. So wild plants and animals will be affected in different ways. Some of those can be predicted and some are less predictable. So let's start with plants. The growing season for plants is changing. In many areas, it's starting sooner and lasting longer, though there are a few areas that are not experiencing that exact change. And organisms can be harmed if they can't migrate to more suitable climates. So if you consider a plant, it has, let's say, a yearly reproductive season occurrence. Plants can only spread their seeds a short distance each year. And if climate change occurs too rapidly, they would not be able to have time to adapt. The other issue for both plants and animals is that we've already have a significant amount of habitat fragmentation, so human developments that would preclude them from being able to spread to a neighboring area. Okay, good. So the last screencast will be on what we can do about climate change.